And then George Wallace was succeeded by Lurleen Wallace, his wife, who made it quite clear when she was elected she'd do what George told her to do. The federal courts ordered Alabama schools to be desegregated, and she gave a televised address to the General Assembly, urging them to seize control of all schools in Alabama, citing the state police authority. And with the concurrence of Governor Lester Maddox of Georgia and Paul Johnston of Mississippi, they organized, or tried to organize, a meeting of Southern governors to fight federal court orders to desegregate. The only other governor to attend was John Keithen, of Louisiana. And the last part of the 60s was filled out by Albert Brewer in Alabama, who he said, "I will do nothing to change the state's rights philosophy and program set into motion by the previous Wallace governors." And our neighbors to the south in Georgia like to sometimes pride themselves on how progressive they are, but they overlook a great deal. Americus, Georgia in 1963. Civil rights protesters are arrested, placed in stockades. Again, television was just in its infancy, but images that came out of the American South shocked the conscience. And in 1964, there were further riots and violence, not just in Americus, but elsewhere. And Florida, which most people don't consider a southern state anymore, in Jacksonville, in August 1960, there was something called Axe Handle Saturday. Just think it was advertised as Axe Handle Saturday. 200 armed whites attacked demonstrators in a park as the police stood by, but then arrested black residents as they tried to defend themselves and demonstrators. And in Jacksonville, there was simmering racial turmoil and violence throughout the rest of the decade, and Jacksonville was not the only Florida city to be so troubled. So folks, that's the backdrop, national and southern events for what happened and didn't happen in South Carolina. And now let's look at our state in the decade of the 1960s. Things were different here. Now, this was not a racial Eden by any means, but things were different in South Carolina because of the political leadership. You know, an old fisherman will tell you that a fish rots from the head down. If you look at what happened in other southern states, look at who was governor and how things deteriorated from the top. If the governor is not going to do anything in Montgomery, you think Bull Connor, the police official in Birmingham, is going to protect demonstrators? No. They take their cue from the person at the top. And again, that's where South Carolina is different. For the first 2 years of the decade, from 1960 to 62, Bob McNair was chairman of the powerful House Judiciary Committee. And then in 1962, he won the Democratic primary for lieutenant governor. In those days, that was tantamount to victory. There was no serious opposition by Republicans in the fall general elections. And he remained lieutenant governor until April 1965, but became governor upon the resignation of Donald Russell, and in 1966 was elected to his own full term. And when he made his farewell address to the General Assembly in 1971, South Carolina was a far different place than it had been in 1960. For this entire decade, Robert Evander McNair, in the vernacular, was a player. And many of us, whether political scientists or historians, would say he was the key player in making a difference. Now, our state, there was, at the beginning of the decade, there was white intransigence, but this led to a change in tactics by black Carolinians, one of whom you're going to hear tomorrow, Judge Matthew Perry, who was an attorney for the NAACP back in this time. Previously, the NAACP had primarily gone through the courts, Briggs versus Elliott. They had not gone to the streets, had not taken to the streets to demonstrate as they had in other states. But beginning in 1960, those tactics changed. And they happened in a rather unusual place, not in the Low Country with its predominantly black population, or even in the state capital. It happened in Greenville County, one of the counties with a smaller black population. And it happened because the black baseball player, Jackie Robinson, had been there to speak at an organizational meeting, and he was denied and actually hassled in the Greenville airport when he tried to use a whites-only waiting room. So on January the 1st, 1960, Emancipation Day historically for African Americans in South Carolina, the first modern civil rights demonstration in our state's history occurred when 250 black Greenvillians marched to the airport from downtown. And then in February, black students from Friendship Junior College in Rock Hill entered two of the town's largest variety stores and requested service at lunch counters, spurring sit-ins across the state in Charleston, Columbia, Denmark, Greenville, Manning, Spartanburg, and Sumter, among other towns. This was just within days after the first sit-in in the South had taken place in Greensboro, North Carolina. And these demonstrations, sit-ins, went on for 3 years. In Rock Hill, a number of these students were jailed in 1961, but they refused to pay their fines. And all of a sudden, they had to find jail space for these folks. And this begins the practice of jail-ins across the state and the South. And when 187 marchers were arrested in Columbia, they were defended by Matthew Perry, and 2 years later the Supreme Court overturned their convictions. But what you have demonstrations, sit-ins, jail-ins, wait-ins at public pools, play-ins at parks. These tactics were used across South Carolina, and observers, even those who did not appreciate what these young men, for the most part they were young folks who were doing a lot of the demonstrations. They sang, they clapped, they marched. They sang "We Shall Overcome," a folk song from Johns Island, South Carolina, that became the anthem of the civil rights movement. But they were orderly and they were well-mannered. They put up with all sorts of trials and tribulations. As James McBride Dabbs, who came from Maysville, not far from here, he could not resist saying that these young black demonstrators were behaving as properly reared young Southerners should be. Now, the response to demonstrations was with the mantra of law and order, that people were jailed. And in every community, pretty much except for one, there was police protection for demonstrators, Orangeburg being the exception, which would continue to be the story throughout the 1960s. And much of the state's media said that demonstrators were outsiders, which was not true. The News and Courier in Charleston was particularly vicious. In fact, editorially, they recommended that law enforcement follow the example of Birmingham and use the whip, the knout, the gun, or anything else to protect South Carolina's civilization from a worldwide conspiracy. Other outlets gave little or no coverage to demonstrators, but the widespread protests and the nature of the protest and the obvious participation of local citizens belied the fulminations of those who were living in another century. South Carolina, in the early 1960s, beginning with the business leadership, very quickly joined by the political leadership, decided on a middle path. As early as 1961, Greenville businessmen, led by Charles Daniel, said, "The day of segregation is over." In fact, at the Hampton Watermelon Festival in the heart of South Carolina's Black Belt, he said, "The desegregation issue cannot continue to be hidden behind the door. Our state needs to treat its black citizens fairly and provide them with decent educational and employment opportunities." Early 1960s also happened to be the beginning of what was called in South Carolina the Confederate War Centennial. It never really caught on despite some oratory and parades, but it was in 1962 as part of that celebration that the General Assembly authorized the flying of the Confederate battle flag atop the State House. And the timing of that decision is, I found, always amazing. It came less than 6 weeks after Harvey Gantt had applied for admission to Clemson College.